to start? Or?
Yeah. Okay. Are you starting?
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's get started. Welcome everyone to the book launch of Peter Zusi's book that we're going to discuss today. And so we're really glad to see so many people. And without much further ado, I would like to introduce our three speakers today. So first speaker is Peter Zusi himself, the author of the book, who probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but quickly to say the book we're talking about today is titled The Integrity of the Avant-Garde, Karel, Teige, and the Biography of an Ambition, published in 2024, I believe. Peter is a specialist in Czech literature in particular, and Central European literature in general. And he has previously taught Czech and Complet at UCLC's in London, where we have met a while ago, 8 years maybe. And is now director at NYU here in Prague. So welcome to Peter. And I briefly introduced the two respondents. So we have Jana Berankova, who's a postdoctoral, Ndiaye Berankova, who's a postdoctoral fellow in contemporary Continental philosophy at the Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences. And besides her academic work, Jana is also a publisher and editor at Suture Press, where she is currently setting up a new series called Constellations. And I'm mentioning this because the second volume of this series will be dedicated to 3 essays by Karel Teige, so very relevant to what we're discussing today. And it will be titled Poetry and Revolution, is that right? Yeah. And the preface will be by Peter. So
I'll start writing it soon.
No pressure from us. But yeah, we hear more about this from Jana in a bit. Our second discussant is Jo Feinberg, also from the Institute of Philosophy at the Czech Academy of Sciences, Department of Modern Czech Philosophy, where I'm also based. I didn't introduce myself, I'm Isabel. Jo is the editor of a recent 2022 English translation, I think retranslation of first English translation of Teige's The Marketplace of Art, where Jana has also recently published an article on Teige. And Jo has also published last year a paper on Teige and the circus, I think, as part of a larger piece on folk culture and the Czech avant-garde, but you're better describe it yourself. And with this in mind, I would like to give the word to Peter, and yeah, go ahead.
Great, thank you, Isa. Can everybody hear me? Is this on? First of all, I'd like to thank the Institute of Philosophy, the 2 particular units which are listed up there, which are, I'm not going to be able to sort of cite the names right now, for the invitation, and Suture Press, however I'm supposed to say that. It's wonderful to be here. It's even more wonderful to have other people be here. So I'm extremely grateful to all of you for showing up. I'm going to say a little bit about the background of this book, as well as what I was hoping to do with it, because it's an odd book in a lot of ways. You oftentimes hear authors saying, or even reviewers of books saying, every book has a history. Well, oh boy, this book has a history, because I basically didn't finish it for about 30 years after the original ideas started to come into my head. So in one form or another, I've been carrying this book around in my head for my entire kind of academically mature life, but it has gone through completely different instantiations. I wanted, it has ended up as a book on Teige, but it could have been actually a number of different things. And I think maybe one of the first things I should address is the classic question that any non-Czech who deals with Czech literature and Czech culture has to confront and have some kind of answer for, which is, how did you get interested in Czech culture? Which always causes me to sigh and think, oh God, how did this happen? I'm not quite sure. But there's sort of an anecdote that I'm not superstitious, but there's an anecdote that I am a little bit pleased with. So my first year in graduate school at the University of Chicago, I was wandering. Further back, I had been here in 1990. I was one of those Americans. But I wasn't really. But I started studying Czech, but I really didn't get very far. And then I went back, I went to graduate school. And my first year, my first month, I was wandering through the main library at the University of Chicago, and literally just something caught my eye, and I kind of stopped, and I took out this book, pulled it out, and said, what the hell is that? And it just intrigued me so much that I checked it out and took it home. And kept it for several weeks, not on my table, because I didn't own a table at that point, but on my floor. It turned out, which I only discovered years later, to be Teige's volume Stavba a báseň. And I literally just had been so intrigued by the design, by what I was seeing inside, the strange mix of content and illustrations. The text I could not read at all. To be honest, I wasn't even 100% sure it was Czech. You can delete that from the film afterwards. But it fascinated me in some way. Then time went on. After a couple of years, I got a summer stipend. I went to Prague. I met my wife, who is still putting up with me and is here helping me get through this. And somehow the Czech thing started to snowball a bit. So at that point, I was primarily working on German literature and philosophy, and my dissertation that I was developing was on conceptions of historicism in sort of German philosophical tradition and literature as they moved into early 20th century avant-garde discourses. So it was really a dissertation on the idea of historicism. But we were living here then as I was writing my dissertation, and I became more and more interested in this guy I kept hearing about named Karel Teige. And then at some point I actually went back. I had forgotten about taking out that book from the library years before. And at one point when I was back in Chicago, I went into the library and found myself looking up a reference and pulling out that same book 3 or 4 years later without having realized that that's where I was heading. So it seemed a little bit fated. Teige ended up being the subject of one chapter of my dissertation. And at that point, when I finished my dissertation, as I say, really the focus was much more on German thinkers. If somebody had asked me at that time, which I note no one did, who would I consider the main figure in the dissertation? I would have said without hesitation Walter Benjamin, because in many ways the dissertation was my attempt to kind of come to grips with certain thoughts and confusions I had about Benjamin's notion of historicism, which becomes very prominent in his later work. Anyway, I finished. I ended up getting a job in Czech literature. That was a random thing. And Czech became more and more part of my intellectual life and more part of my interests. And Teige effectively was the central figure in my sort of ongoing research for a couple of years. And I published a number of essay articles on Teige that were definitely inspired by the dissertation and in some ways sort of pursuing questions and concerns that I had been thinking about there. But the project, I never turned my dissertation into a book, which is the standard sort of academic route. And after a couple of years, I kind of moved on and went in completely different directions and let this sleeping dog lie. And basically didn't think about it for about 15 years. Until then, I had a sort of invitation from Caroline Duttlinger, who's a Germanist at Oxford, who was starting to edit a series at Legende Press on visual culture. and who knew about my Teige work and said, why don't you submit a proposal for the series? It seems like it could fit well. And I said, yeah, okay. I could probably pull this together like pretty easily. And I submitted the proposal, and lo and behold, it was accepted. And then I realized, okay, now I've got to actually write this thing. And suddenly, everything started to collapse underneath me. And I realized that I had thought I had maybe 2/3 of the book written, and I would just kind of smooth things out. And I suddenly started to see these weaknesses in various bits of the argument, huge gaps in what I was doing, and the need to sort of fill those in with a lot more material. So I suddenly realized I had still a major project ahead of me, and it was about 3 more years until I actually finished the manuscript, and many missed deadlines. So that's a little bit just about the background. The reason why I'm telling you this and why it's sort of significant more than just anecdotally is that because of this long gestation, this is a strange book. And in many ways, it's several different books superimposed upon each other, reflecting different phases of what I was interested in, different aims I had. When I realized that this was going to be a book about Teige rather than Benjamin, there were several things that were motivating me in that. I'm assuming that probably most people here have some idea who Teige is because you're here. But the fact is he remains one of those sort of odd birds that within circles of people who have some sort of knowledge of and connection with Central European modernism, he's known, but he's still also very unknown outside of those specific circles. And this was something that I've found very frustrating as I was getting more and more interested in Teige. This guy is extraordinarily interesting, and as far as I'm concerned, extremely significant for thinking about the development of the interwar European avant-garde. There are limited circles of people who sort of constantly point that out, but if you are in the US or the UK or outside of a kind of the Czech intellectual environment, most likely if you mention his name, you see sort of blank stares. During the 1920s and the 1930s, he was an absolutely central figure in terms of the international avant-garde networks. The standard thing that people, including myself, always pull out is, he was an interlocutor, a major interlocutor with Le Corbusier, with André Breton, with basically a number of leading figures in the Bauhaus. We can sort of, and I do in the book, list all of these much more familiar names who all saw Teige as part of the kind of central circle, and yet somehow that has been largely forgotten. The history of his reception after World War II has been extraordinarily complex because of the fact that despite the fact that he was an absolutely committed sort of communist thinker in the 20s and 30s, he ended up on the wrong side of communist cultural politics after 1948 and was effectively silenced. His work was banned and destroyed. In the 50s, he was kind of erased from the history of 1920s, 1930s Czechoslovak culture, and then slowly became a figure who in the 1960s received more and more attention, very much as a kind of sign of resistance against orthodox communist cultural policy. So in that sense, he was sort of a sign, a cipher for why can't we have, a kind of communist, Marxist, maybe is the better word to use here, cultural politics that isn't completely moribund and sort of narrow-minded. That then sort of after 68, 69 came to an abrupt halt. In fact, the project of incredibly impressive projected three-volume edition of Teige's writings. The first volume came out in 1966. That was all fine, came out. The second volume was due to come out in late 68, sort of early 69. It never came out. It had been printed and then basically was sort of put into whatever those machines are that destroy books. And very few copies survived. It's been reprinted in the meantime. And then volume 3 came out in 94, I think, 1994. So, those dates already give you a sense of what a complicated and complex process this was. And yeah, the way in which Teige as a figure has been sort of shrouded in various cultural, political dynamics that go beyond what are oftentimes the case. Then in the 90s, I think, which is the early 90s, when I first heard of him, I picked out that book and didn't know who he was, but within a couple of years I'd heard of him, knew who he was interested, and I think he became the subject of a sort of renewed wave of attention. There were a number of publications that came out in English on him, and some translations, some very important translations, but then that also kind of fizzled out. And to my mind, that's due to two reasons. One is that actually, I think here in the Czech Republic, I think there was, for some people, uncomfortableness with the fact that he was a Marxist thinker. And despite the fact that he had been kind of, declared persona non grata by the post-48 regime, still this could be uncomfortable. And there are, in fact, passages in Teige's writings, especially from the 30s, that still are kind of uncomfortable to read, because there was a period when he was very much supportive of the Stalinist regime and slowly saw through it, and that's to his credit. But there are passages in his work that are still sort of uncomfortable for me. And so I think for other commentators, that was a break on the sort of post-90, post-89 reception of his work. I think one of the other obstacles to Teige becoming more widely known is simply that he wrote about everything. This guy had the most extraordinary range of expertise that it is almost impossible for any one person to kind of follow him along all of these avenues of his thought. And I don't claim to have done so. I've done the best I can, but actually one of the things in the sort of year and a half since this book came out that has been a rolling drumbeat for me is people coming up to me and saying, "Oh, you really could have written more about Teige in film," or it's a great book, but you could have written more about his collages, or you could have done more with ... typography, this, that, and the other. So it's a challenge, and I think most of the secondary literature on Teige, certainly the stuff that's in English and German, to some degree also in Czech, almost by necessity focuses on one aspect of what he does and what he writes on. And that's great in a certain way, but I am convinced that actually Teige's most important, his real significance lies in the way he tried to bring all of this together. And I tried to get some sense of that in the book, thinking of Teige not just as one of the most important sort of theorists of architecture in the interwar period, not just Teige as the main sort of proponent and theorist and propagator of an avant-garde movement called poetism, not just Teige as somebody who sort of revolutionized avant-garde typography, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are all sorts of things like this. But how did he see this all fitting together? And that is where I think Teige actually takes on significance beyond the sort of independent achievements of what he did in every different field. That's where he takes on significance for thinking about the European avant-garde more generally, because that's where he confronts, to my mind, really fundamental paradoxes and contradictions in what we think of as the avant-garde. And that's what I tried to get at with this book. And that's why it has this sort of strange title, The Integrity of the Avant-Garde. And by integrity, what I meant is, how does all of this hold together? And my argument is that Teige is one of the few thinkers who really raised and tried to answer that question. Not always successfully. I'm by no means blind to the ways in which he runs against brick walls sometimes, certain idealistic moments, overly hopeful, overly sort of smoothing over contradictions. But even when he's wrong for very significant reasons, in my reading. So basically, I wanted to try and portray Teige as somebody developing what I call in the introduction to the book, a unified field theory of the avant-garde. And probably the easiest way for me to communicate this is this, we think about, say, Le Corbusier as clearly part of the architectural avant-garde in the interwar period. We also think of Dada as in some way clearly part of the avant-garde in the interwar period. And if you think about sort of constructivist architecture, purism maybe a little bit less so, but I'm not going to get into the details here now. You can nail me on that later. But one of the features is an adherence to an absolutely strict sense of rationality, that a building must make sense, and it must make structural sense, and it must communicate that sense in the most sort of rational way possible. Whereas Dada, well, a little bit different attitude towards rationalism, a sort of celebration of the irrational and a conviction that in the release of the irrational, that there is some sort of liberatory potential that has revolutionary potential and the ability to kind of regenerate forms of culture that had become moribund and that the First World War had demonstrated to be moribund. So, hyper-rationality or irrationality? Well, Teige takes both. Easy to say, that's a contradiction, Mr. Teige. You have contradicted yourself. Of course it is. There's no question about that. But the point is how he makes those arguments for those different underlying dynamics of the avant-garde fitting together. And that's what I think is most important about his project, more than any of the individual achievements. So that's what I tried to get at. The other thing that I was, trying to do, as in the later stages of the book, when I went back to it after many years, I realized also that there wasn't a decent monograph on Teige in English. There were good discussions of this or that field, but a kind of coherent account of his career. There are good sources in Czech, but there wasn't anything really good in English. So I wanted to do that as well, which is why the book has ended up with a sort of 70-page first chapter, which is a kind of miniature book within the book, which is my kind of more standard monograph on Teige, chronologically ordered, and doing the best I can to try and go through the different aspects of what he does. The other chapters of the book are all ordered around conceptual arguments or about particular polemics. And I think of them as being ordered around two different levels, sort of a theoretical level and a philosophical level. So on the theoretical level, I was very interested, first of all, in recontextualizing Teige in a Central European context, and putting him into dialogue, as it were, with thinkers like Walter Benjamin, Georg Lukács, Theodor Adorno, as well as other Czech interlocutors such as Mukařovský, who plays a fairly large role in one chapter at least, and get a sense of Teige, put him back into this Central European context. Now, in a lot of these cases, these were figures that he never had any direct interaction with. Lukács, Benjamin, there's no evidence of Teige ever having been in contact with him. And yet there are very striking ways in which what he's doing resonates with the sorts of things they're doing. Benjamin, as I say, was very sort of central to my early thinking about these questions and remains very central in the book. The last two chapters are effectively a sort of conversation, a comparative discussion of Teige and Walter Benjamin. And on one level, I think that it was important for me to point out the degree to which, some of Benjamin's most famous arguments in his most famous essay on the work of art in the age of its mechanical reproducibility, which has taken on sort of fetish cult status, and is oftentimes pointed to as this incredibly original statement of something that nobody had thought of before. A lot of that is anticipated in Teige's writings from 15 years before, which is not, must say, I'm not trying to say, oh, Teige scooped him, beat him to it. That's not the point. The point is that Teige wasn't trying to be original. Teige was stating things that were, for him, relatively matter-of-fact in the early to mid-20s. And by identifying that as a background for Benjamin, I think it allows one to look at the work of art essay in a different way and not sort of parrot this idea of the originality of certain arguments that actually weren't that original, but to think of how Benjamin is doing something maybe a little bit different with those questions. So that's something I try and do in the book. And obviously, when I do that, I'm probably stepping on all sorts of toes and slaughtering sacred cows in the Benjamin scholarship, but they won't read the book anyway, so it's okay. So bringing Teige into conversation with these other Central European figures was an important point for me. And thinking about the ways that the attempt to confront these underlying dichotomies or dualisms, such as what I was talking about before with rationality, irrationality, that this was a consistent feature of Teige's thought. He's constantly confronting these various dualisms. And for most of his career, you can identify a sort of overriding, quote unquote, dualism that he is propagating in his various writings. So in the 1920s, it's poetism, which is this homegrown Czech celebration of the beauty of everyday life, to put it most succinctly, and constructivism, which was about rational organization, not just of architecture, but of life. So which is it? Is it wandering through a park, smelling the flowers and being happy? Or is it sitting down with, in front of your drafting board and organizing a better world? Well, it's both. In the 1930s, the dualism sort of shifts, and Teige slowly becomes a proponent of surrealism. That's a sort of long gestation period for him. I go through it in some detail in the book. And in place of constructivism, he talks about functionalism for various reasons. But it's still a comparable dualism. So this idea of dualisms as such becomes one of the themes of the book. But I also flip it around and say, well, he's constantly talking about these dualisms, but what he's attempting to do is integrate them. So actually, it's the process of integration that is the real underlying drive in my reading of Teige. It's not that constantly finding dualisms, it's about trying to overcome dualisms. Oftentimes unsuccessfully, sometimes rather successfully, pretty damn successfully, more successfully than I could do. So those were the sort of main theoretical concerns. Then behind that was a sort of philosophical, I mean, I'm in a room full of philosophers, I shouldn't be saying this, but I'll go out on a limb, a sort of philosophical narrative I was trying to pursue. And that really went back to this idea of historicism. So, those of you who have any interest in sort of early 20th century European avant-garde or even modernism, there's this kind of truism that you come across all the time that gets repeated about the avant-garde rejecting history. And the sort of archetypal icon of this would be, the Italian futurists talking about burning the museums and get rid of the Mona Lisa and let's have machines. So it's this idea of we don't like history. History is bunk. Let's start again. And that's a kind of common sense notion of historicism that's extremely widespread. It has its most potent philosophical formulation in the 1870s by Nietzsche, who does it way better than anybody after him, but he, in his essay with the ungainly title, no one does that.
The utility and liability of historical life.
That's it. 1874. He basically sets out in really quite compelling and rhetorically flashy fashion the main arguments against what would become in the early 20th century a kind of anti-historicist rhetoric. And this idea that for Nietzsche, German culture, and that's what he's concerned with, and that's his first accusation is that the Germans are the worst at this. German historicist culture is obsessed with superficial images of the past, with taking over sort of historical decorative patterns, pasting them, to put this in an architectural, pasting them on a building and saying, this is a neo-Renaissance building. Or Gothic elements and saying this is a neo-Gothic element. But for Nietzsche, this is a form of dishonesty. It's a form of disguise. It's a form of masquerading, of acting, of superficiality that hides an inner emptiness. And the fact that 19th century Europeans, Germans in particular, are nothing. So all they can do is sort of hide in these historical masks. That's the kind of notion of historicism that I think echoes on into the early 20th century very powerfully. And in many ways, Teige takes that over, and in particular develops the kind of architectural implications of a split between an outer facade that has no structural relation to what lies behind the facade, in the sense that that's dishonest. Okay, fine. However, again, at a certain point in graduate school, I became weirdly obsessed with an 18th century German philosopher, Johann Gottfried Herder, who is the general sort of short lines about Herder is that he introduces the notion of a form of historical consciousness against Enlightenment thought that sort of aims to be above historical embeddedness. That Herder says, no, context, historical background is everything, and you can only understand the world by thinking through these terms. And what interested me is that Herder, the more I looked, seemed to me to be using the almost identical argumentation in favor of historical consciousness that 100 years later Nietzsche used against historical consciousness. And that's this idea of a formalism, formalistic thinking. So for Herder, the Enlightenment in this kind of, again, this is a little bit cartoony version, but was committed to this formalistic thinking that lost touch with the real world. And that to sort of get beyond that and to get beyond these kind of deadening schemata, you needed to reconnect with historical specificity, with the particular. And for Nietzsche, historical thinking was about the application of formulae, of historical decorative patterns onto and thus distorting a much more sort of amorphous reality. So both of them have this notion of a distorting formalistic mode of thinking, and sometimes their language is unbelievably similar. And yet for Herder, that anti-formalist argument is made in the name of historical consciousness. For Nietzsche, it's made against that very same idea. So this was the paradox that then I was trying to sort of project onto the 20th century avant-garde. And basically say that the critique of historicism, the idea of a rejection of history in the early 20th century, is not about rejection of history, it's about rejection of historicism. And those are not the same things. Historicism is a formalistic, sort of degraded notion of historical consciousness. And thus, an argument against that is in fact an argument in favor of some sort of more organic, spontaneous notion of historical existence. And that is what I think Teige really picks up on and argues for. So for him, this whole idea of historicism is about a false historical identity. It's about masks, it's about charades, but if you sweep that away, you actually come to the true historical identity of the modern age. So there's a paradox there that is playing out in his thinking. And in my sort of elaboration in the book, that paradox is effectively set up by that gap or that's development from Herder to Nietzsche and that kind of uncertainty in the status of the notion of the historical. So that was the philosophical aim I was hoping to pursue. And that's also the grounds on which I put Teige in dialogue with Benjamin in the last two chapters. Benjamin, of course, is also very focused on this notion of historicism and on historical consciousness. And I'm not going to go into my argument there because it's a little bit convoluted, but I sort of argue that Benjamin allows us to really unpack that initial contradiction or development between Herder and Nietzsche and think about historicism and the avant-garde in a way that gets beyond these, to my mind, rather trite ideas of rejection of history. History is bunk, burn the museums. It's more complicated than that. I'm probably going to stop there. Is that okay? Yeah, I don't know how long I've been talking. I have no idea.
I think that's perfect. Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. And writing someone else's biography of an ambition is always also your own kind of biography of an ambition. So it's kind of an interesting process. Yeah. So our first respondent is Jana. So go ahead.
I think it doesn't work.
Try again.
Where is the button?
I think you can just use
Hello,
it.
hello? It works. It works? Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. So I would like to maybe I think what this book really does and why I think it's actually an excellent and very rare book in what I would say Teige studies, or whatever we can call it, is precisely because it presents a sort of a conceptual map And that's precisely the problem. You have a lot of books on Teige in, architecture history and other scholarship or art history or printing press, print techniques and so on, but very rarely arrive to compare and really place Teige within the kind of broader intellectual map, mentioning the theoretical links to, let's say, Lukács, Benjamin, Mukarzowski, Nietzsche, the problem of historicism, and so on. You mentioned some of these problems. I must say that also, just to make you a compliment, when I was a very young student in Paris in my 20s, and what brought me to work on Teige, then writing a memoir master, was your paper on Teige and Benjamin, then available, on G-Store or whatever. So the book wasn't out yet, but that actually kind of brought me initially to this. So that's a long story. Regarding your book, so I wanted to just bring some of those problems that you mentioned in the book. I think first what I found really interesting is this main argument of yours, namely reading Teige through what you call this unified field theory, namely mentioning that kind of countering the argument against the usual dualism that we see Teige as, constructivism and poetism or functionalism and surrealism. And you really highlight the fact that especially since the 1930s, when his thinking complexifies, his main goal is really overcoming the dualism. So that, I think, is really interesting. Regarding the link between architecture and politics that you obviously bring out in the book, mentioning Teige's series of lectures at the Bauhaus in 1930 on the sociology of architecture, or his whole work on the minimum dwelling, reacting to the Frankfurt Siam Congress. You write that basically what Teige seeks is an architecture that has accepted dialectical materialism as its method. And this architecture, therefore, would evolve into a critique of life, the era, and society, and become an instrument for their change and restructuring. Again, we can think here of to what extent Teige's theories of the collective dwelling and so on not only react to the Frankfurt problem with the dwelling for the subsistence minimum in the 1929, but also to theories of someone like Alexandra Kollontai. You write also that Teige's functionalism, when it comes to his architecture theories, was not simply a hyper-rationalist doctrine. Rather, Teige understood functionalism as, so to speak, a form of listening to the material world and responding to what it revealed. You write, in this he differed from Ginsberg and the Soviet constructivists, whose notion of the social condenser conceived of architecture as inculcating, shaping, or even forcing new forms of human behavior, an impulse closer to what Boris Groys has critiqued as the aesthetic dictatorship of the avant-garde. Well, I'm not really sure I would totally agree on this point because, for instance, you kind of seem to almost, when it comes to architecture, you kind of almost seem to describe Teige as something that then came later in the 1960s in architecture discourse with all this learning from, when architecture and urban planning want to learn from what is actually going to happen. And if we think, for instance, of Teige's theories of collective houses, obviously he tries to react, to the fact that under capitalism, the bourgeois family, in the proletariat, the family simply doesn't work as a bourgeois family because the woman has to go to work and therefore it makes no sense for her to cook and so on. But on the other side, if you look at the way he promotes the collective house, for instance, by abolishing the family unit, abolishing the family kitchen, and you actually compare it with later realized collective houses in Litvinov and so on, you realize it was really difficult to put in practice, that actually none of the two collective houses built in Czechoslovakia, one in Zlín and one in Litvinov, actually really arrived to abolish that, family household kitchen and really turn the collective house into this individual cells where women would have an individual cell, men would have an individual cell, and everyone would eat in the canteen, right? So that really didn't happen. So in a sense, he was also, I think, kind of trying to really force a certain social change through architecture, but obviously maybe we could compare to what extent he might be less radical or more grounded in the real than the Soviet constructivists. And that obviously is related to, Teige's interactions with someone from the Prague linguistic circle, namely Jan Mukařovský, and his 1930s essay on the problem of functions in architecture, which is really interesting. Second point that I find really fascinating about the book, and I think it's extremely valuable because nobody had done it before, is, as you mentioned, your discussion of the notion of historicism. The fact that you describe Teige's understanding of fascism as a failure to recognize the true nature of the present world, as this kind of reaction against this reified neo-historicism, which in the 19th century, again, architectural treatise, we find in books, in articles or essays such as Heinrich Hübsch, In What Style Should We Build? This is where Teige really connects to Hegel. You mentioned, Hegel's notion of modernity as a historical awakening, but also this kind of a disillusion when they realize that this historical consciousness turns surprisingly quickly into some sort of a historical self-consciousness, a sense of weakness and immobility, a sense that historical consciousness is not a gift but a burden, this kind of a museal gaze. And that, again, I think that would be really interesting to somehow parallel this to our present moment. I was thinking, obviously, someone like Joe really writes about the end of history and, literature after the end of history. And when we think of the postmodernism and in Germany, all those problems like the Historikerstreit, and we could see, I think there's almost some sort of a parallels between this end of 20th century return to neo-historicism in architecture and elsewhere, in society overall, and this kind of a sense of perplexity when we face this kind of reified form of history. You mentioned Nietzsche's Untimely Meditations and his essay on the utility and liability of history for life from 1874, which I noted down very precisely, as you see. And namely the influence of this essay on Teige's thinking, which you describe as a manifesto against historicism. Again, and this brings us to this notion of this idea that the history or the scientific collection of history into museums and encyclopedia actually entails some sort of a decadence. The scientist becomes almost a kind of a curious tourist, an idler who longs for diversion of excitement in a way who we could say today maybe who consumes history. It's about consumption of history and looking at it as some sort of, as in postmodernism, kind of picking up whatever might serve the narrative here. In which sense the history becomes like an overgrown garden, and actually the excess of historical knowledge prohibits the creation of new identities. So this is something that Teige was really facing as a kind of crisis of this historical, reified historical consciousness, and to which he really tried to respond by being, I would say, the kind of man of his time, to looking in the present, what in the present goes towards the future, what is the wish image, Benjamin would say, or what is the předobraz, as the notion of the kind of foregrounding image that Teige uses in much of his writings. In fact, what Teige tried to react against, you write, was something that Nietzsche describes with this lovely formulation, was historicism as the greedy consumption of indigestible stones of knowledge. I really love that one. So again, Teige's rejection of historicism, you write, is traceable both to Nietzsche and Herder, and really his task in his, multifaceted theoretical thinking was to remain somehow attuned with the present, to be the man of his time in a sense. Teige also very much criticizes, and that's a problem not only for Teige, but for many theorists of architecture and design and art in that era, namely the fact that under capitalism, the bourgeois artist can express critical distance only to some flight to spatial or temporal distance. In other words, only through exoticism or historicism. In fact, and that brings us to this problem of Dada, precisely, that under capitalism, it is only the aesthetic negation can actually be socially affirmative, And therefore, capitalism as such has no artistic style. Again, this notion of the Gothic as the popular style, which I think is a pretty fantasized notion in architectural scholarship, but that's to which they react. What I really like in your book, obviously, are all those connections where you mentioned the connections between Teige and Mukařovský, between Roman Jakobson, the way in which actually Teige's notion of the unified art, or the Ars Una, couldn't exist without Mukařovský's definition of the aesthetic function. When for Mukařovský, the aesthetic function as such, which obviously is an important and inherent part of life, but is rather an operation of the perceiving subject than inherent to the object. Again, sort of like also Shklovsky's defamiliarization, the odstranění, and so on. So again, these kind of dialogues between Mukařovský, this notion of emancipation and autonomy in Teige, which is pretty different from Mukařovský, you kind of describe it quite nicely in the book. You also mention, obviously, kind of allude to the links to Lukács, the realism debate, Lukács' text on realism in balance, mentioning that what really people tried to oppose here was not modernism as such, but in fact this kind of a reified historicism. Namely, mentioning the fact that what people like Teige ask is how is the modern historical identity to be accurately represented today, and what is the proper style of the present? Again, kind of sort of replaying the Heinrich Hübsch, in the Avant-Garde, but giving totally different response to Heinrich Hübsch questions. Also, you compare Teige with Benjamin at some point, highlighting namely Teige's very receptive position towards mass culture. Obviously, this comparison between Benjamin's notion of the wish image and Teige předobraz, or this anticipating image, I don't know how to translate it now, comes quite often. But somehow also showing that in the case of Benjamin, the relationship to modern architecture and modern lifestyle is somehow quite different from Teige. If we think of essays such as Experience and Poverty, where Benjamin actually describes this new modern style, then alluding to not Mies, but actually he mentions Scherbart, Paul Scherbart in that essay, mentioning that this kind of new modernity, this transparency, brings some sort of a poverty of experience that creates a subject which is the new barbarian, he writes, and that the objects made from glass actually have no aura. Whereas on the other side, Teige wholeheartedly embraced the new architecture, at least until his preface to Ladislav Žák, when he gives up on architecture and suddenly starts to talk about this inhabitable landscape, the architecture of nature. So he was somehow much more optimistic than Benjamin himself. And I really love that quote. I think that's in Benjamin's Moscow diaries, when he goes to seek for Asia Lassis or whatever. He's totally in love hanging around Moscow. And he writes something like, "To live in a glass house is a revolutionary virtue par excellence. It is also an intoxication, a moral exhibitionism that we badly need." So again, this statement is a bit of an oxymoron. Kind of first we think, oh, that's a critique of the glass house, but then actually that's what we need. So, this is typical Benjaminian ambivalence here. Whereas for Teige, I would say that's less ambivalent. For him, it's like the glass house, or not the glass house, but in his case, the collective house is, the future that needs to be embraced. And we could think that of the collective house, the Koldum, as also a kind of a dispositif or an apparatus, actually combining the private sphere with the public, with the collective sphere. It's like an architectural articulation of the private and the public in a new way, in which there might not be the transparency in terms of glass, but a sort of a social transparency between the subject and the collective body. And again, my favorite novel is Jiří Weil's Moskva hranice, the Moscow border. I don't know if this was translated in English.
It's being prepared. I'm going to write an introduction to it.
Oh, that's amazing. Such a great news. That's a really amazing novel about early life in Soviet Union, where it precisely describes this kind of a social transparency of the hero Ri, then moving to to Moscow, and it brings up all these paradoxes, namely the question: to what extent is there a sort of a one-to-one correspondence between the architectural form and the social form, and is it possible to achieve this kind of a transparency between the architectural form and the social, between the individual and the collective, and then the question is, when does it actually kind of conflict with, I would say, maybe people's innate desire for opacity? And that's when, as I mentioned, the practical realization of the collective house, that Teige theorized, well, but we're never able to achieve this kind of abolition of the family household that he would dream about. So again, Teige was kind of trying to seek for what in the present was going towards the future. So he was really interested in this kind of a movement and maybe sort of forcing the future from the present, somehow. Again, that's what I wanted to say.
Can I respond to that before you talk? Because otherwise I'll forget what I wanted to say. Thanks so much, Jana. Those are fabulous comments. There are a number of things that I wanted to just say a little bit to. Your first point about, that maybe I was being a little bit too easy on Teige in terms of that comparison with Soviet theorists, and saying that theirs was more of a coercive model and Teige's is more less coercive. I both agree with your criticism and sort of stick by my argument, which it's a contradiction. It's okay. Contradictions are good. No, I think there are a couple of ways to respond. One is simply that there are shortcomings in what Teige is pursuing here. And here I would say that there are gaps between his rhetoric and what would surely be happening in an actual instantiation of this. I think that Teige's rhetoric is saying that the bourgeois family doesn't exist. But he was wrong. But he thought that the sort of architectural forms that exist and have emerged from and continue to propagate these certain types of social relationships were in fact constrictive, were fetters, to use a sort of Marxian term, and that humanity needed to be released from them. And in that sense, there is an underlying rhetoric of liberation. Yeah. As opposed to architecture inculcating new forms. So that is where I would sort of stick to my guns in terms of his rhetoric. In terms of a clash between, what he's actually describing and the kind of reality of this, yeah. Another thing, and I mentioned this in the book, sort of slightly sarcastic aside, he talks about these shared kind of kitchens and canteens as a way of liberating women from the drudgery of household work. Well, you just think who's going to be working in those canteens? Come on. We all, we know. So yes, he doesn't completely lift himself up by his bootstraps there. But I think there's a rhetorical difference there that's distinctive. Another point you mentioned in terms of the parallels with sort of, I don't know if it's our moment, but post-'89, the 90s, and the kind of neo-historicism that went on there, I found it significant, and I actually wrote something in the mid-'90s that sort of made this point. Two of the most, two major books that were published in the wake of 1989 and all the changes in Europe that were quite influential in English-speaking reading circles and beyond, actually. One was, of course, Fukuyama, Francis Fukuyama, titled The End of History. And I guess maybe you deal with that. So that's kind of the locus classicus of this whole more or less contemporary end of history debate. There was also a very popular and influential book at that time by Misha Glenny called The Rebirth of History. So which is it? Was 89 the end of history or the rebirth of history? And to my thinking, it's just getting back once again to this exact same paradox. And you know, it's a glass that's half full or half empty. Where we are now, I don't know. I sort of think we're beyond even that, but I honestly don't know where we are. There was a third thing I was going to respond to. Oh, in terms of Benjamin. Yeah, Benjamin is like the essay that you referred to, Experience in Poverty. I mean, he's trying to be a good sort of constructivist. He's really trying. But his heart isn't really in it, but for reasons that I think are significant. You know, this is oftentimes pointed to as Benjamin's ambivalence, his sort of nostalgia for the auratic work of art, that somehow he knows he needs to sort of embrace the decline of auratic art, but he's still committed to it. But I think, and this is sort of the work of the last chapter of the book, is that Benjamin actually sees the type of historical junk that 20th century architects scraped off the facade and threw into the gutter. Benjamin goes and sifts through it and finds all sorts of stuff that interests him. Not because he wants to put it back on the building, but because it is a form of defunct human wishes, human desires, utopian ideals that still tell us something about who we are and where we've just come from. That, to me, is his ambivalence. It's not just, oh, I like auratic art. It's that there is cognitive potential in this stuff that now we must throw away, we must get rid of. Otherwise, we're going to be sort of falling into a kind of fascist, false aesthetic. So anyway, those were the three things from your extremely thought-provoking comments I wanted to respond to. So I'm done.
So over to you, Joe.
Okay. I had not planned to talk about my own past at all, but it so happens that I have a connection to that same library.
Sorry, the mic.
Is it good now? Okay, it was turned off. Okay, yeah. So it so happens that I also have interaction with Karel Teige in the same University of Chicago library, where I think I didn't remember that you had also gone to the well, I had also gone. You went there first to the University of Chicago, but after I spent a year in Slovakia many years ago. Well, the timing is relevant because I think this around the year 2002, 2003 was probably the low point in East Central European intellectual and cultural history. And I came away just depressed by how a society can have rejected so much of what makes humanity decent, and kind of the idea that the world can be a little bit better, and that things, maybe, even justice and solidarity and such things are just cliches, and that there can be that dreaming about subversion and change is all just a way of the past. And I was kind of came away with this feeling that there was like nothing. Everything connected to this society was supposedly it was only legitimate if it was connected, looking towards the not brighter, but this sort of like future of capitalism. And then in walking around the library of the University of Chicago and reading a few things here and there and looking up books, which it turned out basically every book published in Czechoslovakia is at the Regenstein Library in Chicago. I did surround myself with this memory of this great Czechoslovak culture. I also found the old Dao journals from the Slovak Avant-Garde, and I was just put them all up around my room and was surrounded by them and kind of absorbing them. And so this was sort of my entry into the Czech and Slovak avant-garde was as sort of like a redemption of this part of the world that I think in some ways is maybe similar to the kind of redemption that Teige was trying to accomplish I'm now using Benjaminian terms, to use the term redemption that Teige wouldn't have ever, as far as I know, used himself. But I think it might apply in a way that I'll get to at the end of my comments. But first, where I really did want to start was by saying that this is really, I think, a great book. It's really well researched. The kind of breadth of the breadth of both looking at of the different aspects of Teige's own work, as well as all of the connections to theory from the Central European world, theory of the avant-garde, the breadth of secondary literature that you've really worked through and engaged with intensely is really valuable. And on top of this way that you've been able to combine biography with theory, I find really compelling. And the theory itself, I think, really does shed light not only on Karel Teige's thought, but at least as much on the meaning of the avant-garde and the sort of the intellectual significance of the avant-garde. To start with where you start, the main theme of the book that ties everything together, this principle of dualism, I think this is the first thing that really jumps out at you if you read more than a couple of Teige essays. You read one, maybe you think Teige is all about poetry. You read another, you think he's all about constructivism. You read a couple of them and you realize, okay, these are strong tensions. What do we make of it? And I completely agree that this is really what makes Teige interesting, is that he faces this tension head on. Whereas I would say some avant-gardists try to stick to one side or the other of it. Others do both without addressing the fact that they're contradicting themselves. Others will try to find some kind of synthesis, and often that meant abandoning the avant-garde tradition for them. Socialist realism for many of them was like, this is how we're finally synthesizing these tensions that we were living through before. And with Teige, he really maintains the tension throughout while still addressing it, which I think is fascinating. And it keeps pushing him to new things. He doesn't just stick with the same formulation of this tension. And I think it's great in your book how you show, I think, convincingly that this encapsulates a major productive tension of the avant-garde in general, as well as what I might call an organizational principle that structures the way the avant-garde did what it did historically, the historical interwar avant-garde. And that addressing this tension, I think, I agree with you that it can perhaps be a key to the theoretical stakes of avant-garde thought and to Karel Teige's own theoretical contributions. There are moments when there were moments in reading Teige when I maybe came to believe that he did think that he had arrived at a synthesis, that in surrealism he had reached a synthesis that could connect the kind of constructive elements of socialism and this attention to the world and to realism with the poetic impulse of before. There are moments for example, in the Marketplace of Art, Jarmark Umění, where Teige speaks of a new synthesis of poetry and world. So there are moments when I think of him as maybe thinking that he found the dialectical synthesis at this moment, but I think I'm relatively persuaded by your argument that even in the surrealist phase, he does keep talking about functionalism as something that's not entirely, it's not contained within surrealism. It still is another factor that surrealism pushes against and that maintains this tension throughout. The other thing is your argument throughout the book that I also find very insightful is the point that dualism for Teige and for many avant-gardists is connected to an impulse to integration, and which I find interesting in two ways, because you first show that this is distinct from, let's say, the post-structuralist attitude of keeping disintegration or fragmentation as the final point of analysis, the rejection of the impulse to bring things back into any kind of whole. But it also differentiates this avant-garde, or at least this one avant-garde attitude towards integration from the totalitarian notion of seeking totality as an endpoint that would resolve everything, bring us past all tension, and make ultimately the dualisms that we're struggling with appear to be, well, first of all, surmountable and maybe even illusory. And the real thing is this totality. That's not just something to be stated and critiqued, but a totality to be achieved, which I think you effectively point out that this is not Teige's attitude. And there may be moments. This is a question I would pose, whether Teige at any moment does have an idea of a vision of the future in which dialectical tension would be overcome and all these dualisms would fade away or wither away, let's say, and there would be a new unity that would be lasting and, at the end of history. But when I think it over, I think there are very few moments when Teige actually seems to really point in that direction, despite him using this dialectical materialist terminology that is at this point borrowed from by the 1930s, the more Soviet version of dialectical materialism that does often point to an end of history that would be where all tension is overcome. But when I think of the examples that I can remember in Teige's writing, they're a bit ambivalent on this point. Like there's a moment at the very beginning of Teige's career when he, along with Jiří Volker, they both refer to proletarian poetry as having the potential to achieve a new unity of style like there was in the Gothic period. And so unlike all of these styles that are competing now, we can overcome that and reach this new unity. So there's maybe this implication that, okay, then that will be the end of it. But it's left as just a suggestion, and everything else around what Teige, as well as Volker, I think at that point says is that it's more of a tentative synthesis that's still in history, presumably, more of a constant struggling with these different principles that will keep pushing against each other. So synthesis is more of a process of always synthesizing, which I find a productive way of thinking about the synthetic dimension of avant-garde thought. And I very much appreciate the discussion of historicity and historicism, and tying Teige and the avant-garde more generally into this history of history of philosophy as the philosophy of history, in a sense. And the point that you make that the avant-garde was not just about destroying the past and moving into a future is, well, this is also, it's something I strongly agree with, first of all. And what I found interesting was how you articulate this as in showing that Teige was consistently, even when he points to the future. I think maybe I could deal with a little bit more of a discussion of what the future meant for Teige, but it is always in connection to the needs of the present, and certainly, especially in the early period, in the poetism period, Teige was very much, everything that he actually spent time writing about was about the present, the beauty of this world right now, that can point to something new, that can get us past the other parts of the present that are keeping us from getting to somewhere new. So this is a modernism that's about the present, but is also about the past in a way that I would like to pose a question, because I'm not sure if we agree or disagree on this point. I would like to point to what I see as a major tendency in Teige, but especially in the text that I know best, since I edited this co-edited this translation of The Marketplace of Art, which is Teige's tendency really to look back at history. But he does it in other writing as well. And then the incompleted work at the end of his life, The Phenomenology of Art, would have been another look back at history, a grand historical attempt to bring the present into this great historical movement. And what I see him doing there is looking at the underside of history, or to something like what you called, talking about Benjamin, the historical junk, although for Benjamin he's really looking at forgotten detritus, whereas Teige is concerned with, like, he really looks at the underside of poetry, and the sort of dark revolutionary romanticism, I think was the term he uses, as against the conservative romanticism of other figures, or it's like at every moment he finds the underside of this historical development, and he wants to revive the decadent poets, and the sort of popular culture of the streets of these cities, or the old popular culture of the villages before it got corrupted by the national movements and so on. And so in this sense, I wonder if this lidovost, using the Czech word that you discuss in chapter 3, or popular culture, the popular dimension of expression is not just not antithetical to the avant-garde as one superficial interpretation might have it. It's also not incidental, but in some way it may be necessary to at least Teige's understanding of an avant-garde that needs this other aspect of actually existing history and present culture in order to be in history as motion, because Teige's understanding is not that we sweep away everything in the past and create something absolutely new. That would take us outside of history, as you so at least as I understand you to be arguing. And so Teige needs this other thing to be there, and if you look at actually existing high culture is not up to the task of bringing us, of sort of realizing the potential of the present and bringing us into the future. But there's this low culture that's different from folk culture, but is low people's culture. And in some sense, this is very much a parallel to what Herder's project, which I really appreciated your discussion of Herder, who was also trying to look at the underside of history in order to bring us into a history that's in motion, because people put it in motion, and it brings all of this, the beautiful particularity of the world, just like the kind of things that the poetist moment was trying to point to. This is also what Herder was trying to do in response to people like Kant, to say we need all of this unrecognized or unregistered, to use Teige's term, unregistered expression and practice to move us better into the future. And so there's maybe this stratigraphic dimension or social dimension of hierarchical or anti-hierarchical dimension that is necessary as a complement to the historical dimension for Teige's idea of the avant-garde. Need for this subversive side of history that maybe makes it necessary for the avant-garde to be both ahead, using the metaphor of the avant-garde, but also underneath society in order to push it forward. And so I guess I would close with a little bit of a reflection on this Hegelian idea, or Marxian Hegelian idea of history repeating itself. So we could say this is kind of what historicism is when history repeats itself once as tragedy, again as farce. But is there maybe another way to do it better? And if history can perhaps repeat itself as a kind of surrealist game, would that be a way of bringing us into Teige's idea of what historical engagement should be? Okay.
Thanks so much, Joe. Again, so much I'd want to respond to, but I'll be brief. The final point, I would say, history repeating itself, first as tragedy, second as farce, is the definition of historicism. So that's definitely part of that whole rhetorical constellation of things that Teige is, along with most sort of avant-gardists in the 20s and 30s, is reacting against. And precisely, what would be the surrealist actual liberation from that dynamic? Hard to say. I completely agree with you. And this kind of connects with what you were asking about, with the Koldom and the distinction between the constructivists. I think Teige actually doesn't dwell that much on some kind of idealized image of the future. He's much more focused on figuring out where we are now. It's, whatever sort of idealistic image he has in his mind is already here, but we're just failing to see it. So that's what I kind of was trying to get at with that listening metaphor. It's about actually understanding that we live in a world that works differently from the way the 19th century world did. Why are we still building in the way they built? And how do we just sort of actually see the reality that's surrounding us? And in that sense, it is, I think that's an admirable impulse, because it does inoculate him a bit from some of the easy utopias, easy idealisms that a lot of other Marxist thinkers sometimes fall too quickly into. The other thing I really liked and appreciated in your comments was picking up on my arguments about holism, because that also is another sort of red thread through the book, and the fact that I think for when I was in college and graduate school, there was I would say from post-war period, there was an often very entrenched, too easy dichotomy between holism of any kind, bad, effectively inherently fascist. Totality means totalitarian. And that obviously is very deeply embedded in Frankfurt School thinking, in much, certainly early post-structuralism. and that somehow fragmentation is always good. It always means critical distance. It always means shifting your perspectives and liberating you from any kind of false totality. And I think, Teige is not doing that. He's a holistic thinker, for sure. And I was very much trying to recover that sense of his holistic project in a way that doesn't reduce it to just a sort of nostalgic longing for wholeness, which is effectively already a fascistic ideal. So I'm happy that you mentioned that. That's it.
Great. So I would suggest we open to questions from the audience, and to kind of be sensitive about time, I'd collect, let's say, 3 questions and then give all 3 of you the opportunity to react to these questions. So if there's anything from the audience. Questions, comments?
Could,
I think it's really, I'm no specialist in Teige and all this, but to put Benjamin and Teige together in that way, I think it's really something that it's quite exciting. So, yeah, I think it was.
I should mention, I'm not the first to do it, although I was in my head a long time ago. But there are some other commentators, particularly in Czech academia, who have brought those names together. I'd like to think I do it a little bit more sort of systematically and at length, but it's so obvious in a way. It is,
obvious, but they also belong to different worlds.
Yeah.
So this connection is obvious, but not.
Yeah, in a way, it's more about academics, it's sociology of academics, that this connection has not been explored extensively years ago.
I would maybe just add that if we look in the 1920s and early 30s, Teige is the much better known and better connected figure compared to Benjamin, and maybe to Adorno. And so it's interesting how this inversion of who's well known.
Despite being younger than them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess the post-communist perspective really changed then, because we kind of put, as you said, Teige aside because of his Stalinist, so he belonged to a different world from our perspective growing up in Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
So whereas Benjamin came from totally different sides to us.
Yeah.
That's so the meeting of the two is quite exciting. Rendezvous, unexpected rendezvous. Sorry.
There's a question in the back.
I just had a question. Thank you for the presentation. About this category of the avant-garde, I wonder to what extent you're self-reflexive about it in your study. For example, contemporary theorists like Jacques Rancière would argue that the avant-garde is not separating art from life, or looking at it from a kind of linear historical perspective, but it's about what, in a certain way, can redistribute the sensible world. So I don't know if your Teige investigations would transpose to some kind of new distribution of the sensible world, or if that's just something that awaits further investigation.
I don't think I have redistributed the sensible world particularly, but I think that one of the things that I was trying to avoid was defining anything, including, and perhaps first and foremost, the avant-garde. I don't know what it is. There are all sorts of various different approaches to it and frameworks and definitions that I find compelling. Oftentimes they are completely inconsistent. And I sort of feel like I'm fine with that. There are these various thinkers and movements and texts and buildings and things that exist. And what interests me is why we connect them. Not what connects them, because maybe, but why we think they're connected. And I think that's why Teige sort of interested me, because he took for granted that there was this thing, the avant-garde, and he knew what was in it and what wasn't. But he also never sort of defined it in any kind of dogmatic way. If there's anything that's consistent in Teige's writings from his earliest to his latest, it's skepticism about definitions and about defining anything. Anything that smacks of a rule or a principle is immediately for him a form of constriction, and he is suspicious of it. So in that sense, it's interesting that despite that, he sort of takes for granted that there is something called the avant-garde. And I'm not going to try and defend him from the possibility that that's an inner paradox in his thought. It very well may be. But again, I think it's one that's interesting and productive to think about. But yeah, I sort of can't come down on what is the avant-garde in any direction, despite having written a book on it. Do you want to say something about that?
No, just like I think that it would be totally possible to read Teige through Rancière somehow, as a partage du sensible, effectivement. Because I think what really you find in Teige is this kind of a politics of aesthetics. This kind of idea that you cannot have a revolutionary politics and have a conservative culture politics of, for instance, the Communist Party, namely his rejection of the Stalinism, his redefinition of what is actually socialist realism, when he proposes a new definition of the realism as going to the kind of a dialectical core of the reality. So I think he's really onto something. He tries to think what are the adequate aesthetic and subjective forms that would be adequate to the revolutionary politics of his time. I don't say that he's not sometimes wrong. For instance, there's this famous article where he's not really clear about the Moscow trials. I think you mentioned it in the book. But that's really an exception. Most of the time, he's really striving to find the adequate aesthetic, subjective, and life, expression, or the life forms that would be, or architecture forms, material forms that would, express, put the sort of a political politics and cultural politics in line with each other. And I think that's really something that's interesting on not only Teige, but even if you read thinkers like Kalandra, or this generation of the non-Stalinist, communist thinkers in Czechoslovakia that, unfortunately most of them ended pretty badly, or, because of certain historical circumstances, that there was this attempt to really reconnect the political and the cultural and the subjective, and to go beyond precisely this, to reject the Stalinism, as an ossified form.
Since there's some wine and nibbles waiting, I would maybe say we take one last question, and then we give you the chance to maybe have your final comments, the three of you. What do we think? Okay, yeah.
Thanks a lot for the debate and for the presentation. Let me briefly follow up on the last remarks, right? Like the opposition between the avant-garde on the one hand and Stalinism on the other, as the later as the ossified version of Marxism or of Marxism-Leninism. So my comment or question, maybe to all of you, is, and especially in the Czech historiography of literary scholarship and historiography itself, and history of different different artistic forms, there is this very dichotomic approach to avant-garde as something positive and Stalinism as something negative. Avant-garde is something good that opposes the bad Stalinism, right? So that's kind of the tradition we come from. And my question is, especially listening all of you, Teige as someone who attempted for his whole life to unify the world and theory, right? So my question is, isn't that the other side of the coin? I mean, isn't that the other side of the Stalinist coin, which represents the very same attempt in theory and practice. Thank you. Or to Peter, particularly how you cope with that very tension in your writing on Teige. Thanks.
That's a tough question. Yeah, I mean, there's no question in the second half of the 20th century, after Teige's death, there's this sense of this absolute sort of dichotomy between, as it were, good avant-gardists and bad Stalinists. And yet, clearly, in the 1930s, Teige's not aware of any sort of dichotomy like that. And he only very slowly and very painfully starts to become critical of the Moscow trials, other aspects of what's going on in the Soviet Union, until that sort of breaks out in basically 1938, and the kind of polemic within the Surrealist group when Nezval basically dissolves it sort of single-handedly, and the rest of them are like, you can't dissolve us, you dissolve. You go off and dissolve yourself. And then Teige writes that polemic, Surrealismus proti proudu, Surrealism against the current. And there, basically, he finally says in this kind of full-throated way, this theme that had been increasing in his thought from the mid-1930s, that you start, I mean, I first encounter it in some of his letters, which, private expressions of this to his partner, to friends, and then he sort of gently brings up this idea in some things, and then it comes out in 38 full throat, which is that there's something about Stalin, and he comes at this largely through aesthetic criteria first. There's something about Stalinist aesthetics that is the same as fascist aesthetics. Whoops. And, by 38, 39, he has basically said, and it's not just that the buildings look the same. It's, something else. So, what's fascinating about Teige is exactly seeing somebody who does not want to see a dichotomy that is the one you refer to as sort of reigning after World War II, and in many ways still till today. But he does not want to admit that, but he slowly and very, very painfully, and it has to be said, at great personal cost, he sort of has to admit some kind of intellectual alliance between Stalinism and fascism.
So, actually, I think this question is also a way to answer about Rancière a little bit. But what I find, one of the things I find very fascinating about Teige is that he shows in some ways what Stalinism in theory could have been, in the sense that, like, at every stage he tries to, as long as he can, he tries to interpret Stalinism as, like, take its principles and try to make them, like, adequate to his criteria for what progressive art and society should be. And so I think we can look historically with different access to information, or maybe clearer heads and less connection to the political fray that caused Teige to hesitate before expressing some of his criticisms more openly. And we can maybe say that Stalinism, right from the start, had certain things that it couldn't, that were maybe irredeemable. But we can also see how we know other figures, famously, like Picasso, for example, the portrait of Stalin, but Picasso doesn't explain to you why he thinks that socialist realism is a pretty good idea. He just does his work and then says Stalin is all right too. But with Teige, you get his theory of why socialist realism really should be something that encompasses the avant-garde and should be a continuation of the avant-garde's impulse. And this is part of what I meant earlier, where some avant-gardists would become socialist realists. And I think in many of those cases, it's not just because they were devoted to the Communist Party and they obeyed when the party said you need to become socialist realist, but in many cases, at least that wasn't the only reason. They also were a bit tired of these tensions that were going on, that were unresolved in the avant-garde, and they thought, okay, if I interpret this new idea differently, I can maybe find a way to overcome these older tensions and see socialist realism as a continuation of our older avant-garde project, which, I mean, Boris Groys makes that his critical argument against the avant-garde, but someone like Bedřich Václavek sees this as his justification for becoming a socialist realist, that he's just continuing what he was doing before. So I think, and then Teige, some of his most fascinating writing is about surrealism and socialist realism in this period around 34 to 36, when he's trying to argue why surrealism is the best kind of socialist realism for this particular historical moment and context in Central Europe, in Czechoslovakia. And he loses that argument, which can show you that there were tensions that were, or that this was maybe not a real possibility of Stalinism, but it was an imaginable interpretation of Stalinist ideas that shows you why it wasn't crazy for so many artists to attach themselves to something like socialist realism when they could see it as, they could see all these aspects of modernism that were realized in different ways. And so Teige's main criticism in the first moment is just the Soviet mainstream is doing socialist realism badly. They're misinterpreting the idea, and he cites Bukharin more positively, saying Bukharin's concept of socialist realism is more progressive, but those architects are doing it badly. So there is this interesting tension that is resolved in tragic ways there. But and maybe part of the tension, to get back to Rancière, is that I think there is one of the things that for Teige is continues to be important is that what we might call the aesthetic dimension, or Rancière calls the sensible, but for Teige fits in this idea of poetry, poesie, is something that is both, it's this division of the sensible that always, it's essential for there always to be this freedom of poesie that has to be a part of any broader integrative project, but it's not enough to be only autonomous as an aesthetic dimension. It needs to somehow be connected to construction and building a new society and function and things like this. And so this is, unlike some avant-garde idea that we just disrupt we break down all of the partition of the sensible. For Teige, it's sort of, there's always this partition, but it's always pushing back and forth. And that's where socialist realism did try to break open the sense, put aesthetics everywhere, kind of, but at the same time not allow it to be free the way, at least at the beginning, Teige thought that it could be.
Okay, I don't want to hold you for too long. I'm just happy that Joe mentioned Bukharin, because obviously that's a big influence on Teige. I think it's interesting to look what Teige's theoretical sources are. You know, we find a lot of young Marx. He's very well informed on, you know, the evolution of Marxist scholarship, like what kind of manuscripts, like he's super informed. Like you have this piece by Marx, you know, discovered 32 and 33, Teige writes about it. So he's like super informed. My reading of that, you know, when you come to the Stalinist question, it's really important to, for instance, think of Teige's critiques of formalism, his critique of monumentality, My proposal would be actually to read Teige through really his critique of commodity fetishism. Like if you think, for instance, even like he suffered from the fact that you can have like Baba colonial, functionalist architecture, or that someone like Gochar can do like a constructivist church in Warszowice. That's totally absurd. That's like contradictio in adjecto, because like you cannot have a modernist form with a conservative content. And Stalinism, for him, there was probably something like that. You have really archaic form with the modern content. So obviously, what you said tends to confirm, Boris Groys, because I'm Kunstwerk Stalin, but I think for Teige it might be more nuanced, and we have to think of his critique of the monumentality, his critique of the formalism, and the way how, for instance, he suffers when the palace of the Soviets is being won in, 1933, 34, by this terrible Zholtovsky project, So yeah. But anyway, maybe Isa, you want to close?
Maybe the last word goes to Peter, and then we close up this wonderful discussion.
I would just like to say thank you to organizers and to audience, and let's have some wine.